Hello friends, it's Alfie Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast at the end of history. My name's Alex Hochuli in São Paulo, Brazil, and this podcast is also Philip Cunliffe and George Hoare, who are in the UK. What's cracking, guys?
Hey.
Not much.
Happy International Men's Day.
Right, indeed.
Yeah.
So we're recording this on Thursday, the 19th of November, which is International Men's Day, a sign of pathetic, wounded authority, if there ever was one, in my opinion, which is actually pretty appropriate because authority and its absence is a big chunk of what we're going to be talking about today. Our guest on this episode is Todd McGowan, who's author of a number of books on film, psychoanalysis, and more. But here we're going to be discussing his latest book, Emancipation After Hegel, Achieving a Contradictory Revolution, which was published by Columbia University Press in 2019. This was a book that we also covered in our reading club for patrons. It was episode 157, if you want to check that out. And if you're not a member already, sign up for access to our reading clubs. So this is the kind of second time round. We discussed the book between ourselves, and this will be a great opportunity to discuss it with the author. Just a little bit about the book. It's a philosophical book, which it sounds intimidating, but it's politically quite exciting, and it's very well written, and that's the most important thing. I think it's extremely clear in its prose. It's simple, as simple as it has to be, or as it can be, and that makes it lucid and engaging. So that's one reason that we've selected to discuss it in the reading club and to discuss it here with the author in a way that we wouldn't normally do with a philosophy book. This episode, though, is produced by Phil, and I'll hand over to him to explain a little bit more.
You don't have to make excuses for philosophy. People like philosophy. It's good. It's good to think.
I don't, but that's good for them. I'm not.
Exactly. Maybe in private, George, but you don't have to talk about it. You're a consenting adult, so you're free to do whatever you like in private.
Who are you trying to impress here, dude?
Yeah, but you don't have to boast about it, man, okay? So
I've read many philosophy posts.
I think it's a very lucid book, as you said. And I learned a lot, and also it's one of the rare, unlike George, I don't read philosophy books that regularly, but it's one of the rare kind of philosophy books that I've read where I think there are genuine political lessons to be extracted from it, and I think also kind of really important political insight that I would like to share with a wider audience, which is why we've invited Todd on, and why we wanted to talk about the book, not once but twice. So
very good. Let's see if we can't extract some of those political insights with Todd right now. Okay, so we're here with Todd McGowan, who's professor at the University of Vermont. Now, to listeners, I guess there's a small number of abnormal people out there who'll get their kind of geeky name has some relation to the German philosopher G.W.F. Hegel. But for many of you, maybe that might not be clear, and maybe so much the better. But this is actually the first time we've had someone on to discuss Hegel directly. So we're very happy to welcome Todd onto the show. Hello, Todd. How's it going?
Hi, good to be with you.
Yeah, great to have you. Phil, over to you.
Thanks. So, hi, Todd. And Emancipation After Hegel is your 13th book, if my count is correct.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Well, I hope the count is correct. So I went to the website. So, congratulations. So Hegel is a philosopher from the early 19th century, late 18th century, composed his philosophy during and after the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. And he's also taken as perhaps the paradigmatic philosopher of modernity. So 200 years later, what motivated you to write a book on Hegel at this particular point?
Well, I've actually always wanted to write a book on Hegel since I was a grad student and first read Hegel, and I just never felt like I had the, intellectual background to do it. So first of all, I had to learn German. So that was I did that about 15 years ago. So that made me, got me in the position where I could do it. And then I just kind of gradually put it together, and it was just, it's always been the thing that I've been I care most about. So of all those books, it's the one that really is closest to my heart. So that it's really personal. It's not, I do feel like Hegel really speaks to the time, but for me, it was first and foremost just a labor of love, really, to do.
So one theme that we consistently return to on the show is the end of history. And our tagline on the show is the end of history. Now, one of the things that I really was completely kind of gripped by in the book itself is you've got this fascinating interpretation of the end of history. And I was wondering if you could talk through the conventional interpretation of the claim and then how you reinterpret it.
Right, sure. This is maybe Hegel's most, well, he has a lot of controversial things that he said, but I think this is one of the most controversial because when you hear it, it makes you think like, oh, everything important has already been done and I don't really have anything left to do. And so it seems dissatisfying or dispiriting, especially to leftists. Like I'm a leftist, so for me it seems dispiriting. And it's interesting because a lot of people have taken this idea up, including Hegel himself, but maybe his most famous follower, Alexander Kojev, kept trying to locate the end of history. First, he located in Napoleon, then in Stalin, then in the United States. And then finally, he was an ambassador to Japan. And he said, it's Japanese snobbery that really is the final point of history. So it's kind of funny. And what's interesting is a lot of people that I really like that read Hegel, namely Slavoj Zizek, Catherine Malibu, people like that, they really push back against this notion of the end of history. And there even have been scholars, I guess, of Hegel that have tried to say this is really a Kojevian idea that's been put onto Hegel. And the problem is that Hegel actually does say it. So I was trying to think like, what could he possibly mean? Because he was always involved in contemporary political questions. He wasn't an activist by any means, but he was at least commenting on them and writing about them in his letters. So, and indirectly talking about them in his theoretical works. And so I guess I wanted to try to find a way to think through the idea that didn't make it seem just reactionary and wrong. And so I guess, so what I came up with was this idea, and this I think bore out, it's part of my whole way of approaching Hegel, that I see him as a philosopher who thinks that the point of philosophy is to reconcile ourselves to contradiction, and that the movement of his dialectic is a ever deepening of contradiction rather than a resolving of it. And so that for me was really important. And so then I thought, well, the end of history has to relate to that in some way. So the idea that I feel like this is right, that obviously I feel like it's right or I wouldn't have written it, that history ends when we become reconciled to contradiction and recognize that contradiction is insurpassable, that we're always going to have it, because for Hegel, that's identical to recognizing our freedom. And so that was really for me the point, that it's where the theoretical idea and then the political idea came together. Reconciling to the inevitability of contradiction then means that we're necessarily free, because there's no authority figure that can be substantial, that there's no authority figure that we can rely on, that we just are on our own. And that's the idea of freedom. And so the idea was that once you get to that point, that recognition, then that's really, there's never going to be another historical move beyond that recognition of freedom. So what we do with that, I think, is up in the air. But I think that recognition is the end for Hegel.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, this idea that there's no authority figure that we can rely on, and that's a kind of historical inflection point or really key kind of change. Does this mean that for Hegel, this is when modern politics starts? So it begins when history ends, when we're no longer subject to these pre-modern forms of external authority that we could previously rely on.
That's right. So the idea would be that the end of history is actually the beginning of modern politics. I think that's right. That would be my reading of it. Yeah.
So I guess the question then, and you sort of alluded to this in your answer to what Phil asked, but what are the possibilities at that point then? What distinguishes modern from pre-modern politics, or what is opened up at this point politically?
Yeah.
Well, I think that what distinguishes it is precisely the idea of freedom and this notion that authority has to be divided against itself, so that we can't appeal to it. And I think so that notion that you have to rely on yourselves as subjects, I think is the modern problem. And I think the problem in modernity is, and I think this is one thing Hegel didn't necessarily foresee, the way in which people will try to get out of that freedom and to erect figures that they feel like they can rely on. And so I think that's something he didn't foresee. In other words, he didn't foresee the rise of fascism, I don't think. But I think that's a problem that comes up. But I think it's actually a problem of the specifically modern situation, where you're in this position of radical freedom, and then I think that's a difficult position to sustain. And I'm not sure he understood how difficult it was to sustain.
Yeah, sorry. Just to clarify, I think that the position of radical freedom, that would be the idea that we have to rely on ourselves. Where it's a possibility. Is this right? It's the possibility given to us that we can rely on ourselves, but also it's there's nowhere to hide.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That there's nothing to ground. I mean, the idea of a ground is, I think, important. That there's no substance that you can ground yourself on. So I think this line of Hegel's in the beginning of the Phenomenology, in the preface, when he says we have to understand things not just as substance but also as subject. This idea that everything that seems substantial is split or riven by contradiction, and thus at odds with itself. I think that's such an important idea for him, and I think he thinks grasping that is the modern situation.
So, Todd, I mean, taking that, I mean, it'd be interesting to maybe make that dialogue, I guess, with your interpretation, your understanding of Hegel, and the kind of Fukuyamian notion of the end of history. Because, of course, I mean, our hypothesis, our wager is that we're at the end of history. I mean, according not to the real Hegelian understanding, but at least to what Fukuyama proposes, that that kind of all the big questions are settled, and that now that is being all put into question. But I mean, that understanding is one which relies on or hinges more on questions about political regimes, I think, and certain natures of maybe, the liberal democracy specifically, which has lost its authority. And the Hegelian notion of the end of history, one where there really is no end of history in modernity, because freedom is always there, pushing us on to kind of new levels, as it were. How do you make the dialogue between those two, or is your answer just, well, Fukuyama was just wrong?
Yeah, I think that's my answer. I mean, I think it's interesting, because I think he erects liberal democracy precisely as an authority, right? Like, I don't think it can, even liberal democracy can't then function as this ultimate authority in the way that he wants it to. So I don't think you get to the end of history and then you get some version of authority that's more, that we can live with easier than a king. No, I think you don't get any authority at all, and including the people. Like, you can't, like, the idea that the people know what they want and that they're a secure foundation for a regime, I think is just wrong. So I don't think you can reconcile what he's doing with how I understand Hegel.
Or at least what he was doing. I mean, I don't know how to a certain extent.
Right. I think he's changed his mind too. That's true. Yeah.
So on these questions, I'm glad we've kind of pushed into this territory about the kind of the Fukuyama's account of liberal democracy, and on these questions of the kind of relentlessness of freedom and the lack of any stable ground for authority. So we had a question from one of our listeners who read your book, and Daniel Matthews Ferreira, and we wanted to put it to you. So he said, so how would you characterize, this is his question, how would you characterize the concrete political project that emerges from your book if you were forced to do so without recourse to Hegelian or specialized philosophical terms, so in layman's terms?
Yeah, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's too, I don't know how to use it. If I can't use the word contradiction, I'm going to have a hard time, because I think it's a politics of understanding that contradiction is inevitable. And so seeing the way in which there's no authority to rely on, and then how do you form? And so that means that I think Well, let me just think about it in terms of like the way in which that means what that implies for politics. Like, I think it implies a radical equality, because if everyone has this contradiction at the heart of them, then there's I think a radical equality about that no one has any substantial status over anyone else. And I think that would be at the basis of what I would think politically. But I guess I don't know that you can lay out concrete. I don't think, I mean, this is Hegel's, I think maybe one of his most important ideas, that you can't, when he says that philosophy arises, this famous thing, the owl of Minerva takes flight only with the falling of dust. This is from the preface of Philosophy of Right. Yeah. I think what he means by that is philosophy can't direct politics in a way that would be clear and straightforward. Like, part of it is just understanding where we stand, and then where politics goes, I think it's always up in the air. I don't think we can look to Hegel for a perfect answer for our political situation.
I was wondering whether, maybe firstly, what your understanding of politics would be. I mean, is politics contestation maybe itself? Or do you see it as a space in which where there could be negotiation over the future of society or something like that? And then maybe as a consequence or in relation to that, what does philosophy not guiding politics mean? And how would you contrast that with a situation or the argument that philosophy should direct politics?
Yeah, that's a lot of questions. That's good. Those are all really good. So I guess what I would say is that the reason why I don't think philosophy should guide politics is because it can't. Because I guess I'm materialist on this question, like Hegel was, that politics is always out ahead of the way it's going to be theorized. So that the political struggle is always going to be beyond what the theoretical conception is. So the theory is, in a sense, I think, always trying to catch up, or philosophy is always trying to catch up to political action, so it can't guide it. But I would say, what's my definition? My definition would be, and this is much more psychoanalytic than Hegelian. Hegel would never have put it this way, that I think politics is a struggle over the distribution of enjoyment. That's what so I really think that, and I think this helps us to understand why fascism is appealing, right? Because it organizes people's enjoyment in a way that really speaks to them. And so I guess, so for me, so it's not a question of power. I really would push against this idea that politics is about the relations of how power is distributed in society. I think it's much more about how enjoyment's distributed in society.
That's really interesting, and we'll come more to fascism in a moment, and specifically what the character of its appeal is. But I wanted to get a bit more into your understanding of freedom. So you said you said that contradiction is central to the way in which you conceptualize society and politics in this Hegelian way. So what is the relationship between freedom and contradiction?
Yeah, that's really good. So I contrast Hegel's position with Ayn Rand's. I mean, I know most people don't think of her as a philosopher, but I think she so nicely articulates the position of capital. Like, if you could turn capitalism into an actual philosophy, I think she's the one who does it best. And her insistence that there is no contradiction, I think, is really important. And I think, so for me, the idea that every subject and every thing is necessarily not self-identical. That is, so for Rand, she would say she takes this idea from Leibniz that A equals A, that there is some kind of self-identity. And Hegel really takes up this question really directly. And he says the point is that A doesn't equal A, that there's always some kind of difference included within the self. And I think that difference, the way the self is at odds with itself and never is harmonious, I think that it's on that basis that we're free, because there's nothing that can actually guide us and tell us what to do in any kind of authoritative way. So I feel like that's that key thing. I was thinking, this made me think of this joke. So this priest is walking from the monastery across town to the convent. And he goes through town, and he runs in, as he's walking through the bad part of town, he runs into this a prostitute who comes up to him and says, $20 for a quickie. And he's like, he's a priest. He doesn't know what she's talking about. So he just kind of walks on. He comes to another prostitute and she goes, $20 for a quickie. And he's kind of discombobulated. He walks on and finally he gets to the convent on the other side of the town. And he says to the Mother Superior, "What's a quickie?" And she goes, "It's $20, just like in downtown." And I think that to me is like the perfect Hegelian. Thanks for laughing. That's the perfect Hegelian joke because it eliminates that difference between the sacred or the high, the divine, and the secular. And Hegel has this great line where he says, "The kingdom of heaven is on Main Street." And I think to me that's the real crux. Grasping that is the crux of freedom.
I know Alex has a serious question, but this did make me think, is there a perfect Randian joke, or is the whole point of her philosophy that you basically can't have a joke because everything is just stated factually?
Yeah, that would be my claim, actually. Like, I don't think, I wrote a little book on comedy and I said something like capitalism isn't funny. And I think it's really hard to have it. There are not very many good capitalism jokes.
I love that bit of the book, actually, the explanation, in relation to A=A, Rand, and capitalist ideology, which really brought something to light, which I'd never really considered before. But I think it's something that anybody who has argued with a defender of capitalism will intuitively understand, which is this insistence that things are just as they seem, that there is no social totality, and that the poor are poor and the rich are rich, and that there's no real connection between them. They're not part of a single contradictory whole, for example. So that was an excellent bit of the book for me, I thought. But I did want to ask something back, kind of going back to freedom and maybe advancing towards authority at the same time. Is freedom the absence of authority, or is it the authority of the subject itself? Because I think probably maybe the common sense of the day would say that freedom is the absence of authority.
I don't think it's possible not to have an authority, but I think I think what freedom is the grasp of the contradiction within authority, so that authority is made into itself a subject and not a substance. So I think that turn is really important. So I wouldn't say that I'm not sure that it's possible, and I think Hegel would say it's not possible to not have an authority. So there's always some authority, but it's the relationship that you have to that authority.
Okay, so I just want to make sure that to kind of, to ram this point home. So if modern politics is that condition, where there are no external authorities left, God, nature, emperors, all of those traditional sources of authority are gone. So what is the nature of authority in modern democratic politics then?
Right. So Hegel, in the philosophy of right, he it's interesting because he keeps the monarch in his understanding of the modern polity. And I think that's interesting. And so for him, I think that the monarch represents contradiction within the otherwise rationalized whole. And so I think that for him, the only real figure of authority in the modern world is this figure of the monarch who he says all he does is dot the I's and crosses the T's. He doesn't really have any power. He's just this figure of authority. And so I think that would be the idea of how the figure of authority would operate in modernity.
And that takes us, well, okay, so Alex, you had a question to follow up on.
The follow-up, I guess, then is that, so you want freedom, and if you want freedom, you need to discover what happens when there are no external authorities left. There's no external authorities left to fight, and when the external authorities appear as the mark of our freedom rather than as an obstacle to it. And in relation to that, you talk about how we have to resist the resistance, not just the hashtag resistance that has emerged in recent years, though I assume now has disappeared. But resistance in this sense, meaning, denunciation of those who are up there, those in power. So if we're meant to overcome this spirit or this mode of politics, which is just stuck in denunciation, this kind of, what we could call "fuck you, dad" politics. Where next? Where does a politics of liberation lead if we're beyond resistance, effectively?
Well, I just think that it has to lead toward some a positive assertion. So, like, I guess this is a denunciation of a hysteria in politics, right? A kind of politics that is in love with its own position of resistance, and then doesn't think like it's okay to take power. And I think Hegel was really. I do this little contrast in the book between Heidegger and Hegel, and how Heidegger refused. He got a call. They both got a call to Berlin to become and be a philosopher at the University of Berlin. And Hegel accepted and Heidegger refused. And it's interesting that Heidegger was a fascist and Hegel wasn't. And I think I think it's not coincidental that one wanted to stay in the rural area and one was okay with going up next to the seat of power. And I think that I think it's really important for the left not to be afraid to be in power. I guess that's all. That's really all I mean by that. That we shouldn't have an allergy to power and think that that's like if you're in power, you're somehow corrupted. Like I think it's important for the left to not just be stuck in the position of resistance.
Yeah, here.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to wind it back to the question of fascism. And you make the case in the book that what is so particularly insidious about fascism is that it appears to preserve contradiction, but it transforms it into opposition against an external foe. So it casts harmonious. If a society succeeds in expelling this contamination, then it's able to restore its harmony. And the paradigmatic example is obviously Nazi conspiracies about the Jews.
Right.
It kind of fascism tantalizes us with this image of a substantial state. So could you elaborate on what is the political danger posed by this image of a substantial state, as you put it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the danger, I think fascism nicely, I mean, it's horrible, but it nicely shows it that it requires somebody to be eliminated. Like it requires this outside that has to be eliminated in order to make the substance substantial. And what's interesting about it, I think, is that it doesn't like that there is this kind of affirmation of contradiction, but it gets translated into opposition. And I think for Hegel, that's a real way to think about his politics. But again, it's not like a political program per se, but avoiding thinking about contradiction as opposition. Like when you translate contradiction into opposition, then you've already fallen into this, I think, necessarily into a right-wing position. So I think it means that the figures within the contradiction they're always figures within the contradiction, never the enemy to be destroyed. And I think that's an important thing. And I think once you fall into this oppositional thinking, then it's always going to be an enemy to be destroyed. That is the German philosopher Carl Schmitt, also unfortunately a Nazi, had this idea that only if you don't have the friend-enemy distinction, you lose politics altogether. But I think Hegel really pushes against that avant la lettre, because I think his idea is that actually, no, politics has to be this struggle of contradiction, and the friend-enemy distinction is in some way a flight from politics, I think.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would totally agree with that. I wanted to follow up, I suppose, with this brilliant section where it's called or subtitled Confederate Flags Everywhere. And so I was really struck by it because it's the symbol of the American far right. Right. But at the same time, it's a romantic symbol of failed rebellion, and it has all the kind of, that appeal of the pathetic lost cause. And I wanted to put it to you, does the very prevalence of that symbol show that the right too is engaged in a game of resistance like the left, and that it's unwilling to take responsibility for fully directing society? It's unable to.
Yeah, I think the right is worse on this than the left, actually. Like the right, I mean, even, it's an amazing thing to live in the United States right now. We have a president who's in a position of rebelling against the forces of power, it's bizarre, right? Like, but that's, I mean, his entire, I think his entire libidinal appeal is based on this position of the rebel. So I think if he throughout his whole term has posed himself as fighting against what he calls the deep state or whatever it is, and even if it's his own, his own Secretary of State or whoever, he'll fight against them, because if he can put them in or attribute to them the position of power, he needs to be in the position of the rebels, which is why he does that. So I think I absolutely agree with that the right is even more guilty of this being in love with resistance than the left is, which I think gives actually an opening to the left to say, okay, we're not going to do that. We're going to be the ones that are going to take responsibility. And I think responsibility is a key word. I think that's really a position for the left that the right almost systematically can't do.
So why do you think they don't do that?
Well, because I think it's, if you took away this populist critique of the idea, I think Trump's hostility and populists around the world, the hostility, Bolsonaro, Modi, I think to some extent, the hostility to the expert is, I think, so much of the libidinal appeal that figure has. And so if they ever took responsibility for being in the position that they're in, they would have to become aligned with the expert. And so I think it's politically impossible for them to do that. So I
actually meant the left. Sorry.
Oh, you meant the left. Left. Sorry. I don't think it's hard for the left. I think it's hard for the left only insofar as we're in love with resistance. But I think actually most leftists I know like taking responsibility. I think there is a kind of sense of, and I think even when you were talking earlier about the way in which the sense of the social whole, and we have to take responsibility for that rather than, casting off part of it as though those are dead enders or losers or whatever. Like, I think I think there is this affinity between the left and responsibility, which it goes against, I think, a certain image of the left from, this like, jouir sans entrave, this like enjoyment without limits from this slogan from May 68. So I think it's against that version of the left, which seems like it doesn't want anything to do with responsibility.
But
I think that's right. Like, I think that left kind of abjures responsibility, or at best, I guess what you have today is a sort of a left which wants to take responsibility for society, but I mean, it more in the sense of maintaining a certain degree of harmony, rather than making its claim and making its claim about what it wants and taking power in order to implement the kind of society.
But that's what I was going to say. I mean, are we so Todd, you mentioned the 68ers. I mean, isn't that precisely our problem, that we're ruled by, if not kind of actually ruled by the generation of 68, we're still ruled by their ideas, and that they still dominate our kind of political imagination in one form or another. The romance of rebellion, the anti-authority that's cast as anti-authoritarianism, isn't that still the kind of the predominant mode on the left as a whole?
Absolutely agree. Yeah, I absolutely agree. But I mean, it's interesting that it's also the mode on the right, but yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I think I think we haven't yet, nobody has really taken fully into account the disaster that May 68, as just the synecdoche for that whole movement, was for the left. I think Alain Badiou tries to say that, I like him on a lot of things, but he tries to say that May 68 was the last political event. And I just think that's just completely wrong. Like, I think that whole, because the other thing that it was a turning of economic questions totally into cultural questions. And I think that was also a disaster. So I feel like, most of my friends are still invested in that project. So this is not a popular opinion among where I am, but I do think it was really, I think it was politically not a great thing for the left.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess if both left and right now are today mainly situating themselves in this position of the rebel, right, against some imagined substantial authority, right? So both the left and the right are kind of fighting against the man. That would that suggest that, I mean, that the image of fascism is completely illusory, because fascism would be a sort of ultra politics and an attempt to claim that there is that there is a kind of try to externalize something and make it into an opposition, and that desire to crush an opposition to make society whole and wholesome again isn't something that is not really present in contemporary politics. And that would be my view.
But no, I think that's right. But it's interesting that doesn't the fascist still require the enemy, right? Like, so it requires the end. But what's interesting is the enemy is no longer. I mean, it still sometimes is, right? Like Trump did pick on immigrants, and like there is racist. He's vilely racist too. But I think in general, his main enemy is the expert, and so I think it's interesting that it is a kind of internal enemy. But it's not. It doesn't. There's no grasp of the contradiction. It's still the enemy that must be crushed, even though it's an enemy internal to the society, because they don't really belong to the society. I mean, that's the way I would think it's still I think that's still I would still call it fascism, because even though it's maybe not focusing on this poison within, it's still focusing on an authority that it's trying to get rid of. So I think that's the difference, right? Like it's like, although I don't know, like Hitler did constantly claim that the Jews were this secret authority functioning in German society, so maybe, I don't know how different it is. Maybe, I don't know.
So I think this discussion links really well to a follow-on question that we had from another one of our listeners, Pete Ramsey, who asked, isn't there a danger in the book that you've smuggled resistance to the illusion of that you smuggled resistance to the illusion of external authority back in through a politics of anti-fascism?
Because the fascist leader is the external authority? I'm not sure I understand.
I think it's the idea that the anti-fascist politics then represents an external authority, that there has to be I'm ventriloquizing Pete here, so
just to jump in, I mean, I had read it differently. I think it was that the claim that someone is a fascist is building someone up, for example, Trump, as this big external authority, when he isn't that. He lacks authority himself.
Right. No, I see that point. I guess I would just say that and I think it's true that this label fascism can function that way. Like but I guess I'm using it. I'm trying to be precise about the way I'm using it, that actually, and I think it's true that the fascist leader is far from being substantial, is almost open about their subjectivity, right? Like because they're open about their weaknesses and their contradictions. Like everyone talks about the way Trump constantly contradicts himself. And they think, and I read someone saying just after his defeat that, well, the danger now is that we'll get a new version of Trump that won't be so self-contradictory. And I thought, well, that's not a danger at all, because the contradictions are part of the appeal, I think, to him. So I would not in any way say that the fascist leader is a substantial figure. I think he's almost overtly a subject.
But isn't that I suppose the issue is that for a kind of the resistance, if I'm following the logic of the question, that kind of the mode of resistance politics on the part of the left is part of this reaction that you spoke about earlier, the kind of reaction that Hegel didn't anticipate, that it's a hysterical attempt to recreate an authority effectively, right. In order to rebel against. And
right, I think that's the wrong response. Yeah, I just think that's the wrong response to the fascist leader. Yeah.
So, and you would defend yourself from claims that you've done the same thing by trying to build up a politics of anti-fascism. Yeah.
I mean, I think the difference is that it's anti-fascism. Look, I think that there was this fetishization of resistance vis-a-vis our contemporary fascist leaders, for sure. But I think that, to me, there's a difference between that and offering an alternative political program, which is, I think, the only way really to defeat that kind of figure. I don't think resistance as such ever really gets the job done. Yeah, I think that's pretty. Look at the U.S. election. Like he should have lost decisively and just didn't, because there was no alternative program.
Yeah,
for sure.
Absolutely.
Speaking of an alternative program, you're fairly critical of communism in the book, saying that Marx kind of tantalizes us with offering a vision of communism as a harmonious society, one that's got beyond contradiction, but that kind of draws a veil over the future, so that it can act as a sort of substantial authority, that this kind of moment beyond where things are resolved, to justify, which is used to justify oppression in the here and now. So can you explain what you mean by this and what you find so dangerous in this sort of idea of communism?
Yeah, sure. So I by the way, this is the idea of the book that's gotten the most critique. I've gotten the most response from this, as you can probably imagine. But I don't think I was critical of communism. I think I was critical of Marx and then the actual manifestation of communism. But I can envision a kind of communism that's reconciled with contradiction that I have no problem at all with. But it's more like what Marx actually says, and then how it manifests itself in Stalin. And I think that Marx's idea that, when he says in the preface to the Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, that the bourgeois society is the last antagonistic social form, I think that's once you say that, I think you open up the possibility of doing whatever it takes to create this harmonious society. I think I say in the book, like, if it was really possible to create a harmonious society, then Stalin wouldn't necessarily be wrong. Like, Merleau-Ponty even defended Stalin on this ground. Like, we're going to create such a great future that it's worth it. Like, a few million people are dying, and like, okay, that's really cold, and we would all say that's horrible. But if you thought like, okay, we're going to create, there's going to be no more misery and suffering for anybody, then I think a lot of us would think, like, maybe, right? Like, we'd at least think it was possible. But I think once you understand that contradiction is inevitable and irreducible, I think Hegel's position, then there's no such thing as a harmonious society. And so some kind of suffering is necessarily written into the social order. And so when that's true, then I think you look at the sacrificing of millions in a quite different way, I think. So that's the basis of I guess I say that Marx in a certain way paved the way to the Stalinist horrors, and I think that was the thing that people most.
Yeah, I think this is actually one of the really useful points of the book, is kind of I guess sealing off this kind of lazy thinking that communism is the riddle of history solved, and there's no contradictions, and it's basically anything can be done to justify this state of affairs where all contradictions are solved. But I think the kind of, I guess, the tension there is with a kind of different view of communism, which would be more around the end of the prehistory of mankind. And I think it is a useful corrective to simplistic thinking about communism as non-contradictory. It's more that you have historical contradictions of capitalism, which are then obviously, I mean, I think that is a fundamental, Marxist point, that you would have those contradictions superseded, and then you bring around new contradictions, and that's when the project of human living really begins, when you're driven forward by those contradictions which are inherent in a load of things, but not in the form of society that you just superseded.
Right. No, I totally agree with that, and I think this is Slavoj Zizek's point. I think that's his vision of what he uses the signifier communism a lot wider than I do, and that's his vision of it. So he doesn't think it's this. I mean, he's a very Hegelian guy, and he's very insistent on the necessity of contradiction, but he still claims that he still insists on communism for the reason I think you just said. Like, he just wants to change our image of it.
I wanted to, I wanted to ask a little more on this question, because I wondered, so you base your claim on the fact that Marx didn't talk about this future society in great detail, and you say that this is partly, what allows this vision of this harmonious future that can retroactively justify so many horrors in the here and now. But I mean, it seems that if you could have equally damned him the other way, that if he had kind of outlined in full detail what this future society might look like, that would also fall foul of being a substantial vision that could also just as easily justify all horrors and oppression in the here and now. So
Right. In fact, I think he did the right thing. Like, I think whenever he talked, if I was critical of that, then I was wrong, because I feel like it's really when he starts to talk about the future that it goes awry. Like that little line in the German ideology about the hunter in the morning and the fisher in the noon. Like, I think that's like that. Those are the times when it goes most awry. Like, but I think Marx's analysis of capitalism is still unsurpassed. So I think in terms of just the critical edge, I feel like Marx is like, that's something that Hegel didn't have at all. Like he didn't really have he didn't have an understanding of industrial capitalism. So I think that's and he certainly didn't bring contradiction into thinking about capitalist economy in any kind of sustained way. So I think that Marx was absolutely right not to speculate a lot on the future.
Yeah. So I guess we've got one. I guess maybe we've got just maybe one or two more questions, a couple of more questions, and I suppose the biggest one. So, Alex, you had something you wanted to say.
Yeah, I mean, is with the job then the task facing all political projects, and certainly, I guess, one that we all might identify with, a left-wing one anyway, that project is to reconstitute authority today. Would that be? Yeah,
I really like that. I like that a lot. I think that's right. Like, can you reconstitute authority as insubstantial, contradictory? Like, can you think authority in that way and then form society on that basis? So yeah, I think that's one of the ways in which philosophy or theory does have something to say to politics. Like, it says, it doesn't say what that's going to look like, but it says, like, this is what it has to be, just simply because there's no such thing as a substantial authority. And when you try to invoke that, you end up with all these horrors. So I think that, I totally agree with that. I think that's exactly right.
Okay, superb. Maybe we can leave that there, because that's a nice place to finish. Thank you so much, Todd.
Oh, thank you. It was great. I had a great time.
So, I mean, we did have a question from another one of our patrons named Danny. No surname provided. That they're actually a listener to the Why Theory podcast, and they've noted that even where they live in Scotland, there's lots of Black Lives Matter signs, and then they've been extended to Black Trans Lives Matters, Queer Black Lives Matters, and so on. And so, I mean, I think his question is about identity politics. I'm just trying to parse it here. So his question is that does this impulse to augment the message, that is to kind of articulate various other identities together, saying such and such matters, doesn't that undermine a claim to universality? And then conversely, does the massive influx of corporate money to Black Lives Matter support a claim of universality in that the radical potential had to be smothered? So I guess he's kind of looking at it from two different ways.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes and yes. Yes. So yes. I think when you add these different particulars, I think I claim this in a book, my most recent book, Universality and Identity Politics, that Black Lives Matter is clearly a universalist project. And I think adding these other particular names to it ends up actually retroactively particularizes its universality. So that's the first thing. And then I think the corporate attempts to glom onto it are clear efforts to diffuse the universality of the project and to try to make it into something that can fit within capitalist particularity. So I think in an ironic way, I think both of those things are actually functioning in the same way to particularize the universal struggle. And I think that happens all the time. And I think within the capitalist world, this particularization of universalist impulses is one of the real ways in which politics gets diffused.
I mean, it's interesting. My take would be that, I mean, that particularism is already perhaps inscribed. And I think this Danny had a listener of ours had a follow-on question, which he asked, do you, Todd, see any hope of realizing one's common alienation from self-identity through discourses around BLM and whiteness? They think that no. I think the thrust of their question is precisely that these discourses around BLM or whatever are particularist and are hold to idea of a kind of perfect self-identity. which would
I guess I don't think so, because I think the way in which that, like the Black Lives Matter, I think one thing that really struck me about it was that it was completely non-representationalist. So they were never saying like, we need more black cops, or so it was just saying, as long as Black lives don't matter, then something's wrong with the society. And I think so it was just pointing out the fundamental social contradiction in a society that values life above everything. Then there's these lives that don't matter. And so I think that to me was the universal charge of Black Lives Matter. And I guess I didn't see it as originally particular. So I thought it was originally having a real universalist bearing to it. And then I think the way in which it got manifest, I mean, the way in which, like, for instance, the National Basketball Association here took up all all the corporate infiltration of it, I think is a way that it becomes just another particular cause among others. I don't think it was that, though.
I mean, I get the universality, though. It seems a little bit like maybe bare life for all. I mean, maybe that's the extent.
Well, but I don't. Yeah, I see that point, but I don't because I don't think so. I would have maybe said like black subjects matter, but I think that just to get out of the problem that you're talking about. But I think in terms of the way, I don't think it was understood as bare life, because I think it was understood as like a full Black life matters, right? Like not just survival. And so I think it wasn't, so I think it was important that it wasn't just like Black survival. It was a Black lives matter. I don't know. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, there is this kind of, you could make a bare life critique of it, I think, but I guess I saw this. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So Todd, just a final question, I guess, to bring it back to the beginning. You said, I think right at the top of the discussion, that for Hegel, the point of philosophy is to reconcile ourselves to contradiction. And obviously the concept of contradictions come up a lot. I think the starting point of the book and in how you explain what contradiction is extraordinarily thought-provoking, and you show how that drives Hegel's philosophy. Is it possible to explain to our listeners, to give them something to take away right at the end of the chat, without getting too deep into ontology, in scare quotes, what contradiction is and why it's so important?
Yeah, sure. So Hegel's idea is that everything, when it is structured in just what it is, that it has to, that in some way it doesn't fit together. And so his idea is that this non-fitting together manifests itself in time. So that's his idea. It's almost a theory of time, like why time goes on is because nothing is equal to itself. Nothing is perfectly harmonious. And so this lack of, I think that's the way I like to think of it best, as a lack of any harmony within the self, within anything. And I think that idea that everything is constantly breaking apart. And so there's a way in which he almost anticipates certain ideas of modern physics, I think, that in a striking way, almost the way in which nothing is fully itself, that even the molecules are coming in and out of everything that exists. And I think I think he almost needs to be thought on that level, that contradiction really is the way in which nothing can be perfectly itself. And then I think his idea is that we grasp this through language, that because we have language, we can see the way in which nothing can be identical with itself, because anytime you articulate something, you create this distance between what something is. And even for him, so Kant has this distinction between things in themselves and things as they appear. And for Hegel, that split is really one way of articulating, in a really easy way to understand, I think, contradiction. So a thing has a certain way it is in itself, and then a certain way that it appears. And that's this fundamental split that everything has.
That's really fabulous, Todd. Yeah.
Incredibly impressively done without using too many Hegelian concepts. I remember.
Did you have notes? Because it was.
No, I don't have any notes.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Todd.
Thank you. I had a great time.
We'd love to have you back on at some point as well, maybe to talk about your next book or the one you've just done, or something, something else. So.
Anytime. Thanks.
Excellent. Wonderful.